take home the golden gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us today is Professor David Bernstein. He is the Executive Director of the Liberty and Law Center at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And he's also the author of Classified, the Untold Story of Racial Classifications in America. So this is obviously a controversial subject, but this is what we do at the Washington Outsider Report. We tackle topics that are central to US and international understanding of global issues, and we bring together diverse perspectives that are often overlooked in the academia, in the mainstream media, and even on the street. For those who are newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. And the book talk about this new volume that is coming out largely tackles the topic of the need of the separation of race and state and what that actually means in practice. Before I get into all of this, I'd like Professor Bernstein to introduce himself in a little bit more detail. He is a top-notch and very well-known constitutional scholar. I'd like to find out more about his background and how he decided to focus on this particular topic at such a time where discussion of identity politics and the struggle with the US history and the handling of education on the history of racial issues has become a polarizing factor in US domestic politics and consequently has had impact even on our foreign policy as well. Professor, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you, Irina. Great to be here. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm a professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School, as you mentioned, at George Mason University, and the executive director of our Liberty and Law Center. I've been a law professor now for 27 years. So I've been teaching constitutional law, writing about constitutional law, among other topics, in all that time. And I like to look for issues that have, very much like your Washington Outsider report, that have been sort of neglected in the mainstream academia because it's not convenient or people haven't thought about it or there's political ramifications. So I've written about a lot of different topics about Supreme Court cases that have been overlooked or misinterpreted for a variety of reasons. about conflict between anti-discrimination laws and civil liberties, among other things, abuse of power by the executive branch of the federal government during the Obama administration, and so on. I blog at instapundit.com sometimes. I blog at the Vola Conspiracy, which is a law professor's blog, VOLOKH. And basically, this book came about because in the course of my research on other issues, especially civil liberties versus anti-discrimination laws, I came across some kind of interesting anomalies in how the US government tends to identify people by race and ethnicity. For example, there are certain people like Muslims from the Middle East who are dark-skinned and may suffer ramifications from discrimination against Arabs or Muslims or darker-skinned peoples or hostility because of foreign events in the world. They are not officially minorities in the United States, but if you are a Spaniard who immigrates to the United States, you and your children are Hispanics and thus members of a minority group, or similarly, if you're from Argentina and your grandparents came to Argentina from Italy, you're not really Hispanic at all in that sense. You don't even have origins in Spain, but you are considered members of minority groups. So that's the example of an anomaly. Some people who we normally think of as white are members of minority groups, and people who a lot of Americans wouldn't think about as white, Afghans, Iranians, Arabs, and so on, Armenians, are considered to be members of the white classification. Then there is the weird Asian category. We have an Asian American category that includes everybody from Pakistan to the Philippines. This is like 60% of the world's population. People say from Pakistan and the Philippines have nothing in common, right? They don't look alike. They don't have the same religion. They don't have the same culture. They don't have the same history. They're geographically thousands of miles apart, but we sort of arbitrarily classify them within the same group of Asian Americans. And then other people who are officially from Asia in terms of geography, like Afghans or Iranians or Arabs, are not put in the Asian American group, but sort of arbitrarily put into the white group. So if you live on one side of the river in Afghanistan, your cousins live on the other side of the river in Pakistan. If your cousins immigrate to the US, they become Asian Americans. And if you immigrate, you stay white Americans. So there are a lot of anomalies like that. And one thing that I wasn't really clear on, and most Americans aren't clear, is, well, to what extent are these really official definitions that are enforceable? And to what extent do they they're just entirely self-identified? And it turns out that the vast majority of Americans don't know, and I didn't know, that the federal government actually issued a directive in 1978 setting forth these classifications, creating official definitions, which are indeed enforceable by law. For the most part, no one checks, right? You fill out a mortgage application, you check off your whatever group, no one really checked, but there have been cases out there, and I discussed them. I'm the only one who's ever discussed these cases in detail. I discussed them in my book, Classified, where people have claimed to be African American or Native American or American Indian or especially Hispanic, and some government bureaucrat has said, well, you don't seem Hispanic to us, your last name isn't Spanish, you're not dark skinned at all, why should we include you in this classification? And they have to determine who's really Hispanic under the official legal criteria. And the decisions tend to be, the definitions themselves are kind of arbitrary to begin with, and then the way they're defined and enforced by agencies and courts is kind of arbitrary. So we have this weird situation where a lot of the classifications that we've come to accept as sort of natural and normal, it turns out that they were just sort of invented by the federal government in the 70s for statistical convenience. They weren't really meant to have massive societal effects, but they now affect everything from who gets a government contract, who gets into college, even who gets first in line to get the COVID vaccine.
Well, that's not at all controversial or anything, but I'll start with a very boring kind of question. Who exactly is in charge of that decision making? Who in the federal government started this, and who is in charge of it now?
So what happened, all this sort of started somewhat innocuously. I mean, obviously we had racial classifications in the Jim Crow South and so forth, and the census. But the way the modern classifications really got going was in the 1950s and 1960s, as civil rights orders by the president for government contractors and civil rights legislation started to be passed. the government needed some way to keep track of minority of who is being hired, who's being allowed to vote. Right? You have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 trying to ensure that African Americans are not prohibited from voting in the South. Well, if you don't keep track of who's African American and so forth, and how do you know whether the law is being complied with? So there was originally, civil rights laws were not only about race, and still officially today, there's a criteria for religion, for national origin, and so forth. But back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, many states had laws that said that you're not allowed to ask your employees or your students or anybody else about their race or ethnicity. That was meant to protect minority groups. So the only way to fill out these forms, if you're a government contractor or university, was to look at your employees and say, well, who looks like they're Asian or who looks like they're Black, which you can only really do for the so-called visible minorities, right? If someone's Italian, you can't really tell necessarily by looking at them like they're Italian. If someone's Chinese, even if you're not that familiar with the different, ethnographical looks and so forth, you can at least figure out they look kind of Asian. So pretty quickly, because of that, and because African Americans were considered the main group, and other racial groups were considered to be more analogous to them, pretty quickly things like religion and national origin dropped out, and instead the government was collecting statistics based on race. But then once they start doing that, the question arises, well, exactly how are we defining these different groups? Back in the 70s, it wasn't that hard to distinguish in the vast majority of cases who's Black and who's African American, right? If you have basically the American tradition is if you look African at all by descent, you're African American, the one drop rule. But with regard to the other groups, every agency in the United States government came up with its own criteria. Right, for Hispanic, for example, we now call Hispanic. Some agencies said Spanish-speaking household. Some said Spanish surname. Some said Mexican American or Puerto Rican. Some said Mexican American, Puerto Rican, or Cuban American. Some said Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban American, or other. Some called them Spanish Americans, and so forth. Even for the what we now call the white category, some agencies had European whites, but then they also had other, so groups that were historically discriminated against locally, like Cajuns in New Orleans or Portuguese in New England, all were also classified separately. So this created a huge mess, especially in the education bureaucracy, which was collecting statistics from every school in the United States. So the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time, Caspar Weinberger, who was later Secretary of Defense under Reagan, said, we need to regularize these statistics. Otherwise, we're comparing apples and oranges, and we don't know what's going on. So they set up an interagency commission to sort of decide what classifications are we going to use and what is the definition going to be. And interestingly enough, this was not especially controversial at the time, because really the only purpose of these statistics, of these classifications, was to keep statistics for either federal civil rights purposes or just to track like the educational progress of minority groups. And for that purpose, they weren't ideal, but they weren't crazy. They were crude, but somewhat effective. And all this was done eventually by the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget issued what's known as Statistical Directive number 15, requiring all federal agencies to ask people's race and ethnicity. The one ethnicity was Hispanic, the race was Black, Asian, white, or Native American. And when they issued this directive, the directive specifically said, these are not anthropological categories. These are not scientific categories. They should not be used for medical scientific purposes or to determine eligibility for any government program. But here's what happened. If you're a university and you want to engage in affirmative action, or you're a bank and you want to show the government that you're not discriminating, you're already keeping these statistics based on what the government is asking you to collect. So instead of collecting a whole separate list of statistics, you just go with those. So these statistics were not meant to be used for anything but now purposes, came to be used on every single form that you ever have to fill out your race or ethnicity, to the extent that even in medical research, when the FDA and the NIH were ordered by Congress to figure out like to make sure there were enough minorities being used in studies, the studies were valid, instead of the agencies convening actual scientists and saying, let's figure out based on genetic studies which groups we should be worried about, they just took these completely unscientific, scientifically arbitrary categories like Hispanic. I mean, Hispanics could be from anywhere in the world. They're an incredibly genetically diverse population, and they required scientific researchers to divide up their subjects by whether they're Hispanic or not.
And so, but given the fact that all these people are asked to self-identify, how reliable is that information to begin with?
Their information is not very reliable with regard to self-identification. There are studies out there that show that when people are asked to fill out the census in, say, 2000 and asked to list what race they are, and you ask them again in 2010, the same individuals will like 30 or 40% of the time put down a different ethnicity. And that makes a certain amount of sense because at different stages of people's lives, they may identify in different ways, right? So if you're someone who has a Mexican-American grandparent, but you always thought of yourself as being mostly Irish. But then let's say your daughter marries someone who's Mexican, you start going to quinceañeras from their family, and so forth. That Mexican part of your heritage might suddenly become more important to you. So now you might think of yourself more as being at least partially Mexican-American. So self-identifications are really, so I said in the old days, it was forbidden to ask people their race or ethnicity. Now we've gone exactly the other way, and we allow people to self-identify. And for example, at university admissions, almost no one's ever checked. And there's been litigation in the Supreme Court. The lawyers were, for example, for University of Texas, were asked a few years ago, who checks when whether people are really the ethnicity that they claim? And the answer is we don't check. We just rely on self-identification. So there's a few problems with self-identification. One is that people honestly change their identification based on their own self-identity at different times in their lives. Another is the problem of what is called in my book identity entrepreneurs. These are people who may have some legitimate but vague family stories or known ancestry from minority group. It doesn't affect their day-to-day life, but then when they apply to college, when they're applying for government contracts, suddenly they decide to identify as American Indian or Hispanic, whatever. And then the third is outright fraud. And there are people clearly who engage, it's hard to get a really good grip on the scope of it. But there are definitely people who have no real ancestry of particular groups who claim that ancestry. I think the most obvious example is Native Americans. There are a lot of people who either have vague, like Elizabeth Warren, who have vague family stories that they may have Indian ancestry and decide when they're applying for a job, hey, I might as well play that up, or who don't have any stories at all, but say, who's to say I'm not, right? There's so many different Indian tribes in the United States. They've been around for so long that unless you actually require tribal membership, a tribal membership card, there's no way of telling whether someone's really Native American. So for decades, people were signing up as Native Americans for the Department of Transportation until finally the level of fraud became so obvious that the Federal Department of Transportation just 2 years ago issued orders saying from now on, you must be a tribal member. But even tribal membership is not that clear because Native American groups have changed their membership rules all the time. So there are some tribes that if you're willing to pay a fee, they're welcome to make you an official member. There are tribes that just exist that have only come into existence in the last decade or two that are state recognized, but not federally recognized, that really are, have dubious origins and dubious claims to anything except exist. The tribes have wild varying rules on what makes them a tribal member. The Cherokee, there are people who are official Cherokee members based on descent, who their lone ancestor who's Cherokee they know of, the most recent ancestor was around in 1830, and they are one. I think last I read, it may even be more than this now. There are people who are members of the Cherokee tribe based on having 5,284th Cherokee ancestry. Now they may officially be Cherokee, but for any other purpose other than the official tribal membership, they are really no different than any of their non-Cherokee neighbors. So it all gets very complicated. So again, there's different levels of lack of certainty. I just helped write a brief for the Harvard case on affirmative action now pending before the Supreme Court. And there's yet another anomaly here that we pointed out. You can have twin brothers, one who have one parent who's Chinese and one parent who's Mexican, for example. And one brother may be closer to his grandmother who is Mexican, and one may be closer to his grandmother who's Chinese. And so one puts down his application for Harvard that he's Mexican, Hispanic, and the other puts Chinese. A self-identified individual gets affirmative action preferences, and the Asian individual gets discriminated against, yet they have exactly the same background, they may look exactly alike. So it's all very complicated and just getting more so as we have more and more interracial.
Are you going to send a copy of your book to Senator Warren?
While Senator Warren, I've written about Senator Warren. I will say the one thing, Senator Warren, in my view, I don't know if she really believes she had Cherokee ancestry or not. I'm assuming she really did have these family stories, but I would definitely put her into the identity entrepreneur classification, because even if she really did believe she had some Cherokee ancestry, the strange is that she's American on various forms in the 1980s. She got the job at Harvard, which is as high as you could go, basically, as a legal academic. As soon as she got the job at Harvard, she stopped identifying as Native American. I'm a law professor too. We all get a legal directory with all the law professors in it, and it lists who's a minority law professor. She listed herself as a minority law professor from the 1980s until 1995. 1995, she got the job at Harvard, and suddenly she's no longer a member of a minority group anymore. So those who say, oh, she was really sincere about it, she wasn't trying to get away with anything, I think that's pretty strong evidence, and that doesn't happen to be true. Now, the question is, do we blame Senator Warren for exaggerating the importance of whatever Cherokee evidence she had primarily, or do we primarily blame a system that gives people every incentive to take whatever heritage that they might have that could qualify as minority and use that to their advantage?
Now, from an economic perspective, there's a very clear consequence to this sort of politicking, which is a struggle over limited resources allocated by federal government, by state government, sometimes even by private entities towards particular minority groups and interests, which then become even more limited as more and more people are looking to claim some sort of heritage because they want to have access to those resources. What long-term impact do you think this is going to have on the way these resources are allocated, and what we in general prioritize in terms of whose eligibility for these resources?
So when I was writing the book Classified that just came out, I thought when I started writing the book that people on the right might like this book because they're skeptical of racial classifications by the government to begin with, but people on the left are going to hate it, not because it's not a polemical book really, but just that anything that might question the status quo, they're not happy with, because they're afraid that it would be that under affirmative action already being unpopular, that might further undermine it. What I've found just in the last couple of years is that even on the left, the question you raise about limited resources has become more prevalent, right? Because it turns out, for example, that when elite colleges report their number of African American students, and they want to say, hey, we have 10% or 12% or 15%. It turns out that in that what studies have shown, or informal, that of the African American students, say at Harvard, a clear majority are either African immigrants or Caribbean immigrants or their children, or people who have one white parent and one black parent, in other words, multiracial children. And if you're looking for people who you think affirmative action was originally meant to aid and who would add the most diversity to Harvard, people whose grandparents were sharecroppers and whose great-grandparents were slaves, there are precious few of them. There's been increasing controversy within the Black community on this particular issue, and there's been, just in the last couple of years, a movement to separate what they call ADOS, American descendants of slaves, out from the broader African American category, to leave out the immigrants and their descendants who did not suffer under American slavery. in the context of government contracts, more and more of the contracts are going to immigrants, their children, and so forth, who are from various ethnic groups. Unlike in the university admissions, where Asians, for example, face discrimination, in the context of government contracts, they do get the same benefits as every other racial minority group. So these government preferences and set-aside programs were originally intended to help African American contractors who had previously been excluded by discrimination and so forth, but a very large percentage of the benefits, I'm sure a wide majority, are going to people who claim Asian, Hispanic, Native American status, and fewer and fewer are going to African Americans. And at some point, we're going to get to a point where almost everyone can claim some sort of minority status. So, so there's that. So there's this issue of to the extent this is an affirmative action issue, are the programs really helping those they were intended to help, as more immigrants are taking advantage of the programs as opposed to people who faced historical discrimination in the United States. There's also the political consequence that organized interest groups exist, as whenever there's government goodies to be distributed, organized interest groups gather to try to get constituents to lobby for them, and they don't want to give up what they've gained, right? So Hispanic groups and Asian groups and so forth have really been against revisiting any of these classifications for fear that it will undermine the classifications they've built their organizations around. And what's dangerous to me about that is I think that at the grassroots level, despite all the talk of identity politics we have at the elite level and elite universities where people trumpet their Asian American or whatever identity, at the grassroots level, Americans are mixing more freely than ever. It's really very good news, actually. Back in 1958, only 4% of Americans, not 40, not 14, but 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Now it's well over 90%, and among the young, it's almost universal, and they're practicing what they preach. There's very high rates of interracial marriage among Hispanics, among Asian Americans, among Native Americans, even among Black Americans. It's gone up from 2% to 22%. So there's a grassroots trend towards Americans just becoming mixed, people having relatives and children and cousins of all different races and ethnicities, to the extent that we could easily imagine in a generation or two, all these group distinctions more or less going away, and we all just considering ourselves as having a multi-ethnic American identity. But ideologues who believe that race is immutable, even though they claim that they think that it's socially constructed, they treat it like it's an immutable fact of American life, along with the interest groups that work with them, are working against this. They want the government to divide us by these different classifications, and they want the government to distribute resources based on those classifications. And that's very dangerous, not only in preventing this trend of assimilation and amalgamation from occurring, but also in creating inter-ethnic and interracial tensions, as different groups will inevitably be fighting for a shrinking pie.
I would like to address a very controversial aspect of this, taking this into a somewhat morbid direction, which is the American eugenicist movement, and of course the Nazi Party with their racial classification system, and 1/4 and 1/8, and all these other classifications that had impact in Europe, and of course within the eugenicist movement also had an impact in the United States. How do you see this potential playing to these disturbing historical trends? Is this something that is being taken into account in terms of managing this whole system? The fact that these things could just as well end up working in the opposite direction.
So officially, the classifications tend to be quite broad. So Hispanic is defined as anyone of Spanish culture or descent. So if you have any Spanish speaking ancestry or ancestry from a Spanish speaking country and you want to claim Hispanic status, you can. African American or Black is defined as anyone with origins in the Black racial groups of Africa. So there's no 1/8, 1/16. It's basically how you want it, whether if you have some ethnic origin, if you want to claim it, you can. If you don't want to claim it, you claim one of your other ethnic origin. However, there are some exceptions. The Hispanic classification, by being so broad, there have actually been cases in which someone has wanted to claim Hispanic status to become a certified minority contractor, And the government bureaucrats, the agency employees say, wait a second, but your name is Smith. Explain to us why you're Hispanic. And the person will say, well, my grandmother immigrated here from Spain. She married an Irish guy, but I still consider myself Hispanic. And the government agency, upheld through layers of appeal, will say, wait, you don't look Hispanic to me, so you're not facing discrimination based on your looks. Your name is Smith, so people don't know you're Hispanic. You have blonde hair, blue eyes, you're not really Hispanic. Or in some cases, they are even more explicit, and they say 1/4 Hispanic's enough, 1/8 is not. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, when they used to award preferences in licensing, there's actually a case that says, well, your great grandfather came from Cuba, so that makes you 1/8. We don't really know what to do with that, so we'll give you partial minority credit. So and actually one of the two most shocking things I discovered when I wrote this book is with regard to the Native American classification. There are different government agencies and programs that use different definitions of who counts as Native American. They usually say American Indian. And one, not surprisingly, way of doing so is to say, are you a member of a tribe? But another way, often it's either you're a member of a tribe or you're 1/4 blood quantum Native American. It means that your grandparents at least were fully Native American, or at least one grandparent was fully Native American. So the shocking part is not just that we have an actual racial blood quantum requirement for certain programs, but that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, upon your request, will actually issue you a certificate of blood quantum. I certify that John Eaglefeather is 1/4 quantum American Indian. So how you're determined by what level of Jewish ancestry you had, or those of us who remember Jim Crow in the United States and the 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, or even one drop rule. The idea the federal government is still looking for whether someone was a full-blooded Indian and how long ago and what level they have now, issuing certificates on that basis. While they're doing it for positive reasons, trying to help people based on Indian ancestry, it's still, I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that the government is determining and certifying one's genetic heritage.
That is indeed a very controversial point to consider. And the other aspect of it, of course, is educational policy. There's been a lot of talk, debates, and even lawsuits over educational curriculum, the so-called critical theory, and the study of racism and the study of oppression. How do these policies fit into this debate over what and how much should be included in educational system in US schools?
Well, and I think there were two major reasons why the government in the 60s and 70s, when they were focusing on racial classifications, chose racial minorities as the focus, right? They could have added white ethnic groups that historically faced a lot of discrimination, like Italian Americans. They could have focused on religious discrimination against Catholics, against Mormons, against Jews, and they didn't. And there's two reasons for it. One reason is that in the old days, you weren't allowed to ask people what their race is. Nowadays we all self-identify, but the old days it was considered potentially a hostile question to ask someone to protect people from having to reveal minority status. You weren't allowed to ask them. So how are you supposed to report statistics to the government? And the answer is, well, if someone looks Black or looks Asian for these purposes. So that was one reason. But the other reason was there was clearly a sense among government bureaucrats back in the 60s and 70s, who's Irish, are able to assimilate into the general population, that racial divisions will be permanent, and that any group that we define as being racially different than other Americans, such as Asian Americans, such as sort of ambiguously, at least some Hispanic Americans, that's a permanent division. And because that's a permanent division, we have to be especially monitor their progress. And the way that gets to your question is that the critical race theory group of people have adopted that view from the 70s that race is socially constructed by the American context immutable as their own ideology. Even in the face of strongly contrary trends over the last 50 years of wildly increasing rates of interracial coupling, right? So, but if you read the critical race literature, you get the very strong view from these theorists that race and racism will never go away. And since race will never go away and racism accompanies it, we have to continually divide the public by these racial classifications and redistribute resources within those classifications in order to ensure equity and so forth. I think that this is wildly incorrect. I mentioned the contrary trends, but also we have to keep in mind there were differences in American history that people believed at the time were immutable and never go away, and yet they have. So there was a long-standing, for example, hostility to Catholics in the United States that included the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s to the most powerful political organization in the country at the time with millions of members. In 1960, millions of habitual Democrats would refuse to vote for the Democratic ticket because John F. Kennedy, a Catholic, was the head of it. And contrary-wise, a lot of Catholics would only vote Republican, voted for Kennedy because they felt like an oppressed minority group. Nowadays, it's not that, I was born in 1967, this is not that much longer than I've been alive. 62 years later, we have a Catholic president, we have a Catholic Speaker of the House, a Jewish Senate Majority Leader. We have, I think now 5 Catholics on the Supreme Court and 2 Jews, or 1 Jew, I guess now as Breyer has left, and no one really even thinks about it. These distinctions were extremely important back in the 50s and 60s. White ethnic groups are similar. There's even a book called Beyond the Melting Pot written in the early 70s, suggesting that ethnic groups were going to have a lot more staying power than we thought, but it turns out they really don't. No one really thinks about whether someone's Italian American or Irish or German anymore. And you come up with all sorts of other examples, obscure, not so obscure, the hostility Mormons used to face, including mass violence against them. Jehovah's Witnesses used to face a lot of hostility. There were weird regional ethnic conflicts that no one thinks about. The Cajuns faced discrimination in Louisiana. There was hostility reflected in Sinclair Lewis's novels between Germans and Scandinavians in the West. There was conflict between Basque ranchers and German farmers in the upper Midwest. And these conflicts have faded into history. And not only do we not see these conflicts having any real impact on anyone's life anymore, we think of them as being faintly ridiculous. And my hope is that 50 years from now, we'll look back at what now seem like uneradicable racial conflicts and ethnic conflicts, say, yeah, those also now seem to us faintly ridiculous. And the way to move towards that goal is to encourage the separation of race and state rather than treating these racial characteristics of people as somehow being immutable.
As the US population is becoming more diverse and more mixed, with some descendants of slaves sometimes ending up also being descendants of slave owners, and as these distinctions are becoming increasingly harder to define and lose much of the original meaning, whether in terms of resources or anything else, we've seen other factors being brought into the play, such as the intersectionality arguments of other sub-minority factors in conjunction to these racial issues. How do you see that, what direction do you see it moving? Do you think this is a temporary fad of desperate people who are losing the original raison d'etre, or do you think this is the new trend that is going to further polarize the country and take it into an entirely new direction?
Look, the most basic point that the intersectionality literature made, which is that if you're a Black woman, you may face more and different kinds of discrimination than someone who's just a woman or who's a Black man. I mean, that's that point. I don't know that it was especially original even then, but it makes a lot of sense, and I don't have any real objection to that. But then the idea that that's developed, which is that people have these intersectional identities and and that we could sort of rate their level of oppression by some arbitrary decision as to which forms of identity trump others, without any real sociological or anthropological basis, but just what's politically convenient, doesn't appeal to me at all. And I really do think, I mean, I belong to a swimming pool at a local apartment building, and the apartment building is sort of in a working class neighborhood, so that's who the tenants are. And I consistently see not just black-white couples, which is not, which even when I was young wasn't that unusual, but I see a lot of couples where the male part of the couple is white and the his girlfriend or partner or wife, as the case may be, is black, which was extremely unusual. I don't think I ever saw that when I was a kid. It was sort of just not, almost, it wasn't illegal in most parts of the country, but it was sort of unheard of. It's very, very unusual, and no one looks at them, no one says anything. It's just sort of part of the background. And I think if you read a lot of the literature from critical race theory, it's like, oh, there's been no change in racism in the United States in the last 60 years, and people have these intersectional identities of oppression that we have to take, that have to be the primary part of their identity. I just think at the grassroots level, this just doesn't make any sense. It's academic theorizing that is completely divorced from the underlying social reality. If we want to look, there are definitely groups in the United States that, thanks to intergenerational cultural and economic phenomena, are much less well off and find it much harder to integrate into the mainstream of American life than others. But this is not necessarily a racial issue. Immigrants from Africa are doing pretty well. You guys don't seem to have that much trouble integrating into mainstream. Many African Americans, for that matter, who live in upper middle class or middle class neighborhoods don't seem to have trouble. But there are pockets of intergenerational poverty in certain rural areas and inner cities where the schools are dysfunctional. There's a lot of dysfunctional families, incredibly high rates of single motherhood, high rates of welfare dependency, where resources, if you're going to direct resources, should be directed at trying to figure out how to solve those problems, which at this point are not primarily racial, but primarily result from other factors. But then there's also, if you look at the statistics, if you look at definable groups of Americans statistically, one of the groups that's worse off are whites living in Appalachia. And we know that the opioid crisis has hit Appalachia very hard, but it goes beyond that. They're very high, again, very high, bad schools, very high rates of single motherhood, high rates of various forms of cultural deviancy, alcoholism, drug addiction, unemployment, gambling, family violence, and to say, well, they're white, so we don't, so intersectionally, they're the elite, doesn't really make any sense. And one thing that the focus on race has done is disguise the fact that there are these vast differences within groups. Not every the so-called mild minority myth with regard to Asians is another example that we say, well, Asians overall doing real, don't have to worry about how Asians have much higher than average socioeconomic standing than average Americans, but there are certain subgroups that are doing quite poorly, and no one pays any attention to their specific problems because they're subsumed under this Asian subheading. And Asians are now sort of, by the intersectionalists, considered to be so-called white adjacent, which in practice just means that they're doing reasonably well. So there are all these, if you're an actual sociologist and anthropologist, you'd obviously be making much finer distinctions within all these groups than these crude intersectional categories. But the political salience of these categories is overcoming common sense.
From a legal constitutional point of view, do you see these recently polarizing issues of identity politics coming to the surface as requiring an additional level of scrutiny beyond what has traditionally been allotted? Do you think the trend is in the other direction to informally liberalize the level of scrutiny allotted to racial characteristics and discrimination-related issues?
Well, one thing that struck me very strongly when I was doing research for Classified, the book, is that there's been a lot of affirmative action basically started in earnest about 50 years ago. And there have been a lot of cases challenging various affirmative action policies in universities, and especially in government contracting since then. But in basically every single case, the objection that's made is the government group over the other. But the plaintiffs in each of these cases, meanwhile, implicitly conceded that the classifications themselves made sense. There's only one case I know of where the court even really directly addressed the issue of scrutiny of the classifications. That case involved a affirmative action program in Florida that gave affirmative action preferences to Hispanics, and someone challenged it saying this is both overbroad and under-inclusive. It's under-inclusive because why include Hispanics who are white, but not some of the darker minority groups like from the Middle East or North Africa or parts of Europe and Asia like Armenia and so forth? Why include like someone from Spain but not someone from Armenia? And so that's under-inclusive. Over-inclusive, if you are going to limit it, why include people of European descent who happen to have Spanish ancestry? And in that case, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said that while we review challenges to affirmative action programs generally under strict scrutiny, once the classifications themselves are only subject to rational basis, the lowest form of scrutiny. And that doesn't make any sense to me, because the black letter law is that all racial classifications are subject to strict scrutiny. So if you want to be classified as a member of a minority group and the government says, no, you're white, that white classification should be subject to strict scrutiny, and the government should be able to explain coherently, persuasively, and with a compelling interest of why that white person from Spain gets benefits you don't, and the like. But no one's ever made them do it. There have been a couple of Supreme Court justices who have brought up in context of other affirmative action challenges the absurdity of someone whose ancestors got kicked out of Spain 500 plus years ago, who are Sephardic Jews, claiming now minority status as Hispanics on that basis, or the way that we consider all Asians who have nothing culturally or looks-wise in common to be members of the same group. But there haven't really been direct challenges to the classification scheme that we use, and I'm hoping that the Supreme Court or lower courts will begin addressing those issues. One way that they might, if they don't address it in the Harvard case, the Biden administration is considering creating a new classification for Middle Eastern and North African Americans. And this is, yet another arbitrary classification. What does a Muslim from Morocco really have to do in any way with someone who is an Aramaic-speaking Christian from Iraq? Other than geography, they may not look alike. They don't have the same religion. They don't have the same culture. And why should Iranians, for example, be in that classification, but not in the Asian classification, along with Indian Americans with whom they have probably more in common in a variety, or Pakistanis with whom they may have more in common. So someone might challenge this at the administrative level. I'm hopeful that, having written a book about this, obviously everyone wants a book to get some attention, but specifically, I think it's something worth raising in litigation if you're going to challenge affirmative action programs, even if the court rules that certain kinds of affirmative action may be allowable under strict scrutiny, the classifications themselves should be scrutinized.
Do you believe that if, at some point down the road, the racial classification issue will become the new Roe versus Wade?
I don't know. I might. Look. My strong impression. I'm, as a law professor who's in the academy, I am surrounded by the culture of those who support affirmative action programs in higher education. And I can tell you that whatever protestations they make about diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, and any other rationales they give, that's mostly because that's what the Supreme Court requires. The true underlying reason why we have affirmative action in higher education and in other contexts in this country is it was meant to redress the specific harms of African Americans. And one reason I could tell you this is because whenever I point out in any kind of public debate or private debate, like, hey, most beneficiaries of affirmative action in the United States are no longer African Americans. Because there are a lot more Hispanics and Asians altogether than there are African Americans, and they're all getting contracting benefits. My interlocutor always comes back to the African American circumstances. That's what really motivates people. And there are ways of helping African Americans without having even truly a racial classification. For example, you could prefer people who are from high poverty zip codes. Not all the high poverty zip codes are majority African American or overwhelmingly African American, but they disproportionately are. You could use this category of American descendants of slaves. It's not a racial category because it wouldn't include an immigrant from Kenya or someone who's the child of the Jamaican ambassador who decides to stay in the United States, but it would include people who self-identify as Black descendants of American slaves. So there are ways of doing it much more narrowly that may get around these criteria, but you really have to ask what you're accomplishing. Right now, the rationale the Supreme Court has demanded, the diversity rationale, really makes no sense. Let me give you an example. University of Texas was before the Supreme Court with regard to their affirmative action policies. University of Texas was approximately 20% Asian and approximately 20% Hispanic. The vast majority of the Hispanic students were Mexican American, as you'd expect in Texas. The Asians were mixed, but primarily Chinese. Imagine you are a member of the Hmong Cambodian minority from Minnesota, tend not to be as successful with regard to team. Well, we already have a lot of quote unquote Asians, so you don't get any benefit. We may actually make it harder for you to get in. But meanwhile, someone who's a wealthy Mexican American whose ancestors have been in the United States since the 19th century, own a lot of land and so forth, are of complete Spanish origin, they get benefits, even though we already have like 2,000 Mexican Americans. So why would it be that having your 2001 Mexican American adds more diversity than having your first Hmong? And the answer is because we're using crude racial classifications that don't actually account for people's actually underlying cultures. So, you know, the current way the Supreme Court is going about things is that it's allowing state universities to use what is essentially a phony diversity rationale that doesn't make any sense. The other thing that doesn't make any sense is that they say, well, we need to have enough people of each ethnic group that people don't stereotype them and so forth. But it turns out that percentage always, in practice, tends to match the applicant pool. So why would it be that enough in the University of Michigan litigation, that having enough African Americans means 15%, but having enough Hispanics only means 8%, and having enough Native Americans only means 1%? Are people going to if you're trying to expose people to a broad range of opinion among Native Americans, why would you only need 1/15 as many? So the whole thing is frankly dishonest, a subterfuge. The Supreme Court has been allowing universities to basically lie through their teeth about what they're doing. They really engaging in soft quotas to try to keep the population of students representing the underlying percentages in the population of Hispanics and African Americans. And if that's the goal, then that should be said forthrightly. And then you should explain why, for example, in the Hispanic case, despite the fact that most Hispanics in the United States are post-1965 immigrants and their descendants, they didn't suffer Jim Crow, they didn't suffer slavery, they were protected by civil rights laws the entire time that they've been in the United States, why they should get a benefit that no other immigrant ethnic group is getting. And it's very hard to explain why that would be.
Now, and I know that you've got to run, but I would like to wrap up with one last question that's hopefully, as provocative as the rest, which is the issue of allocation of resources to developing communities in education, in particular districts. We have seen that some communities, predominantly minority, Black or heavily Hispanic communities in urban areas, they suffer from assorted social problems, high crime areas, juvenile delinquency, broken families, and so forth. We keep hearing about all the diversity in the US government, all the diversity inclusion programs. We keep hearing about the allocation of resources to education. And yet we keep seeing the same social circles struggling with the same problems for generations. How did these racial classification procedures that were meant to support these particular groups did not make it to the most of the people who needed them the most?
Well, in practice, I hate to say this, but in practice, a lot of the policies that are engaged in by universities and so forth are primarily aesthetic in nature. Now, what I mean by that is we need to have enough black faces, enough brown faces, that someone looking at a picture of our class or our yearbook or at our literature will not see a predominantly white and nowadays white and Asian student body. And we don't. And the easiest way to get enough students who will meet those criteria to find people who are already middle or upper middle class who go to decent schools who could potentially actually do the work. It's much harder to take someone who's at a school where the average person graduates with a 7th grade reading level and try to bring them up to a level where they could do the kind of work that would be required at an elite school. So in a sense, the affirmative action benefits are primarily going to middle class and upper middle class members of these minority groups who, not surprisingly, are the ones who have the most political influence. But, my challenge, this is getting a little bit far afield from what I've written about in Classified, a little bit outside my expertise as a law professor. But to the extent that people are really concerned with the progress of African Americans and Hispanics and say we need to do something about educational dysfunction and disparities, things like saying, oh, let's get rid of the SATs because the SAT is racist because Hispanic and Black students do worse on it. To the extent the SAT is actually measuring educational achievement, educational progress, and so forth, and work, abolishing SAT is not getting rid of the underlying problem. Talk most about these disparities often tend to be, in my opinion, against the sorts of policies that might actually address the disparities, like giving school choice. Look, there's nothing you can really do in modern times about kids who are disruptive in public school. Like in my dad's day, he said the disruptive kids would get sent to the principal's office and just have to sit there all day so the kids could learn. This is not acceptable with all the laws we have about children's right to education, this and that. But what you can at least do is you can at least give parents and kids who want to achieve, who want their kids to have good education, a way of getting out of the system and putting them in school and giving them a choice of a school that is able to enforce discipline, is able to enforce standards. And what to do about the other kids is a bigger problem. But the motivated kids are stuck in these places, and they also suffer, and that drags down the averages for everybody. But yes, like I said, if you want to try to address disparities rather than looking at race per se, look at places that have dysfunctional schools. Look at, there's probably schools in the United States where 95 or more percent of the kids are from single mother families and have a lot of social dysfunction. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an educational expert. What you do about those problems other than school choice is something that's a little bit beyond my own ability. But just saying, oh, this is institutionalized racism, well, okay, it may certainly be the part of the after effects of the Jim Crow system and all that we had, but what good does that do us? Just getting rid of the standards doesn't actually help people achieve educationally, and putting people in over their heads educationally is not always the best idea either. So how do we actually try to bring up the level of education? And the way to do that is not to say, oh, let's just single out people by race, but to actually figure out what are the underlying social dynamics that are causing dysfunctional schools? How do we disrupt them? How do we intervene in families? This is again a little bit beyond my expertise as a law professor, not something I address in the book, but no one wants to talk about the fact that a lot of the social pathologies faced in the United States, and not just in minority communities, faced by lower income Americans in general, stem from the fact that over 40% of all children in the United States are born to single mothers. They usually have fewer resources economically, parent-wise, than other children. And more important, these single mother families are concentrated in the bottom half of the income scale. College educated women, only 5% of college educated women give birth out of wedlock. So if it's 42% overall, college educated women, it's only 5%. You can imagine among non-college educated women, it's much higher. And for those who didn't even graduate high school, it's astronomical. If you want to solve various problems in the United States, start with figuring out what you could do to either better support single moms, or better yet, figure out a way to delay or avoid them becoming moms unless they have a responsible partner involved. And again, this is an issue that's not a racial issue. It cuts across the entire fabric of the, let's say, bottom half to bottom third of the American income scale. And it's creating really two American societies where the people who are better educated and live in wealthier neighborhoods, it's rare to meet someone who's being raised just by their mom in a relatively impoverished background, but it's kind of standardized, very, very, is sort of a de rigueur in the in other communities, again, not so much by race, but by social class.
Well, it sounds to me like the way to address these problems greatly outlined in the book, which I hope everyone interested in the debate on social and political issues driving U.S. domestic policies today, is not to suppress the discussion, but to have more of it, and not to eliminate the discussion of race from education, but to have a broader and more and deeper picture of what actually went on, which is what your book, I think, will help accomplish. I hope everyone watching this will read the book, and I hope you will challenge yourself to ask questions about the usefulness of these programs and what are the better alternatives, what works, what doesn't, and what do you want to see from it. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Professor Bernstein. And for those who are watching the Washington Outsider Report, we'll be back on the Coalition Radio next Tuesday, 9 p.m. And with you was the editor-in-chief, Irina Zuckerman. Thank you very much.